Hi, my name's Rob Ryder, speaking from West Cornwall, and I'm joined again tonight with Patrick Quanton in Andalusia. Hi again, Patrick.
Hello, good evening.
Yeah, a cold, windy West Cornwall here, but we're surviving. So I'm hope the technology stays with us, but we'll see.
We'll see.
So we'll see. We'll have a quick recap now. So I just want to give you a couple of observations from the formation of a human being. So thankfully for myself, I come across this information with you quite many years ago, and I implemented it immediately into our life. I've been looking into holistic health, natural health, probably about 4 years before we met, and again, instantly we implemented it into our life because I had kind of a vision in my mind of the consequences if I don't implement this, and especially when you're dealing with children at a young age. And I had this kind of vision that you could have potentially a child who's just struggling a little bit in the world at 4, 5, 6 years old. There's nothing actually wrong. They're just struggling a little bit and it's perceived the wrong way. And 10 years down your road, you've got a child heavily on drugs in a mental institution. And that's kind of a vision I had, not only potentially for myself, but for all parents now. And unfortunately, most parents, when they have what we would say is an issue, which is really just a child growing and trying to understand the world, the first port of call will be probably a teacher or a GP. And neither of these people really would understand the information that you gave us last week. And then by the time they've struggled and things are getting worse and they've got to maybe a psychologist who understands attachment theory, a lot of the damage would have been done. And so that's one question, just one observation I'd like to comment on. And another observation to recap last week was, I remember a few years ago you saying to me, the reason a lot of so-called, this label autistic children get hooked on screens is they're finding stability in the screen world that they're not finding in the real world, which actually makes sense now from what you were saying last week. And obviously we're coming to this digital future, which seems to suit lots of people who are ruling the world, if you want, who would want people in the digital world. But like you said, if we connect that statement you made to me a few years ago with the previous conversation we had last week, it makes sense, because you're saying this behavioral things, should we say, are children not finding stability in the world, whereas the screen, it's controlled and it's stable. So that's kind of my observations from last week. I don't know if you've got anything to say on that.
Yeah, the screen, of course, is something to hide behind. You can on screen towards the world, you can be anything you like, and you can also protect yourself from anything that you don't like. So it's a lot easier than real life, particularly life close by. So children who are struggling with their immediate surroundings are more likely to find their stability in a screen world, a world in which they can hide things quite easily and can pretend to be somebody else. They also, on the screen or within that whole setup of the screen, they can find whatever their talents are. They can explore more of the things that they really feel comfortable with and totally ignore anything else. So there is a complete different balance, an artificial balance, if you like, between the screen world and the real world. So that I think is an important issue. And the other issue that is very important, of course, is the fact that when a child is displaying a different kind of behavior than what we would like it to be, then the child must be wrong. There must be something wrong with the child. And therefore, the child needs therapy, right? But if we carefully look around the natural world, then we can see the same things with our pets. If you look at a dog, and whenever we say naughty dog, if you really analyze it from a natural point of view, the dog has only followed its natural instincts. It's responded to something, in its natural way. So why would it be different for a very small child? Last week we talked about how the influences are forming the child inside the mother, and for the first 3 years it's a basic formation. So everything that the child is coming in contact with, all information, all the energies that it's coming in contact with, are made into tissues. They're made into the real human form that life is going to take. And then from 3 years onwards to the teenage stage, it still is a sponge for information. It just soaks up the information around it. The only thing that is different, or that is starting to become different, is that the child is starting to try out the things that it's already learned. So the first deep base on which his life is built, that is already solidly there, and the child is going to try this out. Yeah, so it's wanting confirmation of that. It's trying out how that works in the real world. But you have to realize that these are very fundamental things. This is about if I don't eat my vegetables and I cry hard enough, my mum will get me fish and chips. Because I like it. And mum does that. Okay, now we're getting somewhere as a child. So from the teenage years, then the whole package, the whole formation, how that person is formed, is then being tried out in the world. And then we move into the young adult who will be confronted with the real world constantly. But the child, it's about its basic, deep foundation of life, who that person is. So if we're talking about children behaving in an awkward or a disturbing way, then it's not because they think about it and they just want to be naughty. No, it's because that is their natural instinct. This is how they've been built. And the fact that it doesn't fit in with what we, as the outside world, want them to do is really our problem. It's not the child's problem. But we make it the child's problem. And from then on, the child is the problem. And that will continue for the rest of his life, almost, until he finds as an adult, and usually it's an older adult, that finds another balance. But it becomes what we call a trauma. It's a childhood trauma. And the specialists are always looking for traumas in the childhood, in young children, or even during pregnancy, because they know it plays a major part in how that person is going to be formed. But blaming it on a trauma is one thing, and then dealing with the trauma is another thing. Now, in order to deal with the problem of childhood trauma, as is stated by the medical profession, it's always good to know what we're talking about, because words do mean something, even though very often we are disconnected from the true meaning of the words that we're using. Trauma. The word trauma is a Greek word, and it basically means wound. It's a wound. It's an injury, physical wound that needs healing. And in effect, the medical profession knows that, because within hospitals, there are trauma centers. And what do they treat there? Injuries. People with severe injuries, right? They don't treat children there who had a traumatic youth or whatever. But gradually, the profession, it is basically because of the medical profession, we've been starting to change what we understand the word trauma to be. So when we're looking for definitions, we come across things like a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. So that is more than just a wound, just an injury. It can now also be psychological. And if we carry on, because for everything nowadays, you find for every word, an expression, you find lots of different ways of explaining it. So you could also say that a trauma is a severe and lasting emotional shock and pain caused by an extremely upsetting experience. Now, I want to make clear that when we hear the word experience, certainly in relation to something like trauma, we tend to think in terms of something that acutely happens. So it's something that has struck us and had a deep impact on us. But we fail to understand that it could be fairly normal things, far less dangerous, or far with a less impact, but that it lasts for a long time. And that's also an experience that we could call traumatic, right? So we moved from physical injury to psychological, emotional, mental states of disturbance, lasting disturbance. But if you look at the definition of a psychological trauma, then it says it's a person's experience of emotional distress resulting from an event that overwhelms the capacity to emotionally digest it. I want to point out two things. One, it's a personal experience. In other words, the event itself is not called traumatic. The event is not extraordinary, not per definition. It's the personal experience. And what makes it traumatic? The fact that the person no longer has the capacity to emotionally digest the experience. So the two things that are important is, first of all, the person responding to an event, the way that that person responds makes it potentially a traumatic event. So if the person responds with a lot of fear, deep fear, lasting fear, then that adds to, or that puts it on the path towards becoming a traumatic event. The event itself is not traumatic, right? And secondly, how is this person capable of dealing with that event and the aftermath? And that makes a big difference. So this means that when we are looking, if you want to, when we are looking for a traumatic event in a child's early life, then it's a mistake to think that it must be something extreme. No, the event itself is not extreme. It's how the person responds to that event that makes it extreme. And if the person is incapable of overcoming that event, that makes it a lasting trauma. So in other words, any event, a burning house, the loss of a parent, whatever it is, you know, mum being a drunk, whatever it is, it's just part of life. If that child is capable of seeing it and dealing with it as just being part of life. So there's nothing abnormal about the event. We have to look at the individual. It's the personal experience that is important. So it's the child. How does the child experience his or her life? Don't look for one event. It's a series of things. It's life in general for that child. And when that child can not cope with what is happening with his life, her life, then that will have its lasting effect on the future of that particular person, that particular child. And then we see what you described as, you know, in later life or teenage years, we see young adults or late teens who are very violent or who have aberrant behavior, uncontrollable behavior we don't understand. We don't know how it happened. No, because for all those years we failed to look at the child, and we were looking for an event, or we were saying, oh, if this child is taken away by it by Social Security from its drunken mother and put in a nice little home, and it's got its own bedroom, you know, and it can decorate its own bedroom, then that child will have a happy life and it will have no trauma as a child. That is ludicrous. That is not how nature works. You see, so the traumas in children are about the child not being able to cope with life as it is presented to that child. It hasn't got the capacity to emotionally digest the life you present it with.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of notes there. One is a quite a simple observation. When you've got animals that have had trauma, being maybe attacked by a predator or something's happened in the pack or whatever, that trauma really doesn't last long. They deal with it, they move on. So I'm presuming with human beings, with our expanded awareness and consciousness and this thing we have called memory, where we can visually relive things, I would presume memory holds us back in moving on like the animals would, because we have a more vivid memory, more expanded consciousness, and we can relive events, especially what I've learned with dogs, with my interaction with dogs. Even though they haven't got our visualization and our language, if you've got a rescue dog that's been beaten, and if you start to feel sorry for it, even though it can't intellectually understand, you stop the dog from moving on. And humans want to be kind and nice to dogs, but the dog just wants to move on. But with human beings, it's slightly different, and we've got this memory of the event and how things happen around the event. So is that one of the main differences why human beings struggle to move on from trauma?
Yes, and it's an interesting one and a very important point to make. And indeed, in nature, when there are extreme events, don't call them traumatic events that happen to animals. These are extreme events. What happens with their memory is that at the moment of the event and the aftermath of the event, they will learn from that. So they won't remember the event, but they'll remember, if you like, to behave differently in similar situations. And they take that with them. That is the memory they have after the event. Yeah, there is no revenge feeling, or there is no feeling sorry or whatever. They just move on, but they've learned something from it. For humans, it's different. And this is an important one that we haven't talked about yet, but that I need to mention because you mentioned memory, and this is how it works. So this is why humans, or this is one of the things, basic things, that humans are differently made from animals. Our cells, every single cell of your body is covered in little antennae. These are antennae that are listening out to the environment, the energetic environment, the vibrations, the frequencies that these cells are surrounded by. Now, every antennae listens out to one particular frequency. That's how you can visualize it. One frequency. If that frequency hits the antennae, it vibrates, it is alive, if you like, and when it's touched by that, stimulated by that frequency, it sends a message into the cell. And in the cell, as a result of that message, one particular event happens. One particular response by the cell as a result of that stimulation of that frequency. So if that frequency is anywhere near that cell, it will hit the antennae. The antennae is alive inside the cell. There's one particular response, always the same. This is what we have. This is how our memory works. But it's the memory of the cell we're talking about now, because a cell is the basic form of every living organism. So the whole human being as a whole works like that too. How does that come about? Well, the cell makes these antennae, and it learns how to respond. So it fixes the response to that particular information. That information comes inside the cell. This is how the cell responds. Basically, there are two types of antennae. One type of antennae is always on the lookout. These are our basic natural antennae that are looking out for us all the time for our survival. So even when we're asleep, these antennae work. Even when you are unconscious or in a coma, these antennae work. They pick up these signals. They want to keep you alive. And the responses are fixed. You can't change them ever. Yeah. You can't stop breathing, even if you wanted it to. You can't kill yourself by holding your breath. You can't stop your heart from beating. So any of those things, all your survival is by permanent antennae. They're always there, they're always on the lookout, and they always have the same response. And the response is one that will help to keep you alive, to keep the cell alive, and to keep you alive. The second type of antennae are antennae that are not always deployed. Just think about it. We can't be listening out and responding to every single frequency that we are surrounded with, to every single bit of information that reaches us. It will be far too much. Yeah? We don't have the capacity to deal with all those. So the human being has the opportunity to stick out these antennae or to withdraw them. If they're withdrawn, they disappear into the membrane of the cell. And if they're in there, they don't pick up any frequencies. They're not connected. They're switched off. What does that mean? That means that even if that frequency is around the organism, around the cell, you will not get a cellular response. You could say the cell has no idea that that frequency in the outside world exists. Only the antennae that are sticking out. And we decide which ones we're listening to at any given moment in time. So that's an important one, because those antennae are things we can choose. The response that those antennae are giving it's always works on the same lines. It's one fixed response. However, these are learned responses. These are not fixed in nature, as in, this is what you need in order to survive. So we're not going to allow your small conscious mind to be able to play with it. You can't reach that. That's fixed and that's it. But these other antennae for other frequencies, these responses been written into your personal diary, your personal memory bank. Most of those, great majority of those, are written within the first few years of our lives. So that means fetal life and the first few years of our child as a child. And that is why we say that children, young children, very young children, they're just sponges. They take up the information and they fix it into their system. This is how they do it. They create an antenna for that particular frequency and a corresponding response inside the cell. So if the antenna is out and it gets activated, that's how the cell responds. So you can now see if you as a person are sensitive, which means my antennae are out for certain information, for certain energies, then you will always respond in the same way, in the way that your system, your unconscious mind, remembers it. That is your basic memory. That's not your conscious memory. That is your unconscious memory. That is the unconscious memory that helps you through life, because it fixes the responses, which means you don't have to think about it anymore. It's like when you first start to learn to ride a bike, it's very difficult because there's so many things you have to think about. so many things you have to coordinate, so many things you have to look out for. And you have to put it all together. But once you've put it together, you don't have to think about it. Everything comes automatically, even when you get slightly out of balance, even if when you go over a big bump, you automatically respond. What is that automatically? Well, I'm on my bike, so those antennae are out. This is what I've learned. Everyone has got its fixed responses, and together they keep it going. That is your memory. So now these children have fixed memories and fixed responses to their environment, to certain energies in their environment. So when they're 16 or 20 or 30, they will still have the same basic responses that they had learned when they were 3 or 1 or -2 months. That is what makes this so difficult to deal with. And that is where the real problem lies, because what has caused this unusual behavior of the young adult, the teenager, the young adult, the child, even what has caused that particular behavior, it's the environment of the child. And those, of course, are people that don't realize it. They have been told, are told, that the problem lies with the child because they're loving parents. Yeah, fine, good, great. But they fail to see that they are the problem. That is where the problem lies. And I'm not saying that they're bad parents. I'm saying that there is a mismatch between the foundation of that child and the world that it's presented to that child. So it's the mismatch that is the problem. The only ones that can really deal with it or that can change it are the adults who've got control, hopefully, over that environment. And that is the foundation of where we need to go and what we need to deal with.
So my observations there, I've got a few, maybe 2 or 3 observations that we can expand on tonight. So you mentioned social services coming in and taking children because in their opinion, so-called expert opinion, it is the best interest of the child to be taken into state care. Now, there's an enormous political arena and information really around this that we don't want to get sidetracked. But one is state care. I mean, I've spoken to homeless people in the street, and a lot of these homeless people have actually come from state care where they've been abused physically, emotionally, sexually. So the state care, it is literally out of the frying pan into the fire. Mm-hmm. But what you've got with at least your own parents, it's you could say a frying pan that you're comfortable with and that you could say. So your mum's maybe an alcoholic, your father might give you get drunk on a Saturday, come back and give everyone a slap around the head. But you can deal with that because you know that you were born into that and you know that. And so you got the one aspect of social services coming in for safeguarding children. And then again, putting them into another environment which is full of abuse. But let's take that aside and say, okay, it's not full of abuse. Even still, you've got the trauma of the separation. So even if the state were coming in, you're still adding another trauma on top of other trauma. And although I would say this is just my personal opinion, there's a limit. You know, if you know a child is in genuine, absolute danger of their life, that there's actual sexual abuse taking place, and you know that for a fact, there could be a threshold that, okay, we need to act quite quickly here for the benefit of the child to save that child's life. But what we're seeing more and more under the issue of safeguarding, I mean, some of what they call red flags for safeguarding now is a mother just want to make her own medical choices, which she has the perfect right to. Even if you want to go into natural therapists, that could be seen as a red flag. If you want to homeschool, that could be seen as a red flag. So there's obviously a level where some people would have to intervene. Now, many years ago, that would have, I would presume, would have been the community would have got together and said, listen, we need to have a word with this family in our community. We'll deal with it in-house. But obviously that's not the world we live in. And there are limits which you can allow children to be traumatized. But most of the stuff we're seeing is, like you said, you know, the mother's got a little bit of a drink problem, the father's got a little bit of a bad temper. That's just what they're living in and the trauma they're creating with the separation. Whereas in my opinion, if I was, you know, working with the local council and social services, my investment in my money would be going to work with the family, to, if they had this understanding which you're talking to tonight, would be to try and work with the family and work. Whereas they're too quick to intervene, and that creates another trauma.
Yeah, I think that's the right word for it, because removing children from their home, from their land, from the place that they've always been, that they've grown up with, and the energies that they've grown up with, and that they know, you know, whether it's a comfortable knowing or an uncomfortable knowing, but they know. So therefore, their antennae and their responses, they are geared up for that kind of environment. So it's a trauma to remove a child from. Therefore, you need to really consider whether that trauma of removing the child from its known environment would be worth it. And it's always done under perceived danger. Now, I would like the definition of what they consider danger. You've already mentioned a few that to most people are not real dangers. Yeah, if you refuse to have your child vaccinated, well, I mean, to some people that may be extremely dangerous. That's their opinion. It's not a real danger, as in, you know, I let my 3-year-old or 2-year-old child eat with 3 lions every day, and that child will have to fight for its food against 3 lions. That's a different kind of environment. That's a different danger, if you like. So lots of things are done in our world, and are put upon people. Decisions made for people instead of people, instead of letting the individual decide for themselves, because of the danger. But they don't actually define danger as the root definition of danger. They make everything into dangerous. It's potentially dangerous. Yes, that's correct. Breathing is potentially dangerous too. Drinking water is potentially dangerous too. So therefore, take all that away from people and have an institution, have a government, have an authority to tell you what you should be doing. The only amazing thing about this is that whatever the authority tells you is much better, is much safer for the child, for the adult, for the whole community. When it goes wrong, they never have to take responsibility for it. So they're always right because they say so, right? So
Yeah.
And that, I think, is again an indication to say it's all personal stuff. So it's the child stuff, how the child responds to its environment. But don't forget, when you take away a 6-year-old from his parents by force, that 6-year-old already has almost 7 years, include the pregnancy, of getting used to that environment. And there is one other thing, and that is that if you really want to take it to the limit, then you could actually state that every child, whatever the environment it grows up in, gets traumatized. Every child will have things in their environment, their immediate environment, their family environment, will have things that it's not comfortable with. We all need to evolve, and that means we get challenged. You get put into an environment in order to learn a particular lesson. More than one, but there is one big one underlying everything else. So in that respect, you could say we all have, emotional shock. We all have extremely upsetting experiences as children. Even the ones that grow up in what society calls loving environment. People seem to forget, and certainly the authorities want to forget, that a loving environment can damage a child just as much as what we decide to call a non-loving environment. Yeah, because we say that, as you said, you get a slap on your head or you get beaten up by a father. Yeah, that is, in certain terms, a not loving environment. Well, that depends. I've heard stories of parents that had to go to extreme lengths to try and control their teenagers out of fear that they might end up in the drugs world or the child trafficking world. And extreme measures did include chaining the teenager to the radiator. Yeah, not done. This is irresponsible. Well, this was a loving father who had come to the end of his tether, didn't know what to do anymore, didn't get the help he required from social services, from the authorities, and he was desperate to keep his daughter at home, because if she escaped, then she would end up in a real mess. So it's all about perspective, yeah? And we should look at it from the individual's perspective and not from a perspective of authority or a perspective of believing in good people and defining or not defining good and bad people.
Yeah, so there's, just before I go on to the last question, there's just want to expand slightly on that. Well, a couple of things. One, again, similar to the medical profession and doctors, like you mentioned, they've normalized levels of certain hormones or vitamins or whatever in your system. Everything's normalized. And within the child, they've normalized what a child should be. This is how a child should develop at this stage. This is what their behavior should be like, etc., etc. Now, in England, in Ireland, we have what you call the Romani gypsies, or the traveling people. Now, a lot of people have different opinions on these people, but this is a people that have been around for a very, very long time in a very, very specific culture. A lot of them are illiterate, going back in their culture. A lot of the kids don't go to school or drop out early, illiterate. They're known, well, cultures do change, obviously, but they were known, should we say, up until recent times through sorting disputes out with fisticuffs, all fair, whoever wins, wins, and the argument's over with. So they were quite a rough people, a fighting people, mainly illiterate. In their culture, as it was anyway, it would be a disgrace if a man can't provide for his family. So a man had to go out to work and provide for his family. It was a disgrace if your wife had to work. That was a shame on the man. Now, we can judge this all we want, but this is a culture that's been very strong, had their own issues, but have survived and have thrived. And we judge that culture. The Incas, where Edith's from, they didn't even have a written language, and they're some of the best engineers and best agriculturists mankind's ever known. So again, we're normalizing things and judging and thinking this is how it should be, which is the opposite of what we're told. We're told that we want to express diversity. You know, I'm a great admirer of the old traveling culture. It's changed now because they're being dragged into the system. So that's kind of one observation. And another quick story, I had a friend from Northern Ireland who was grown up when, should we say, the last maybe 30 odd years ago, when if they didn't allow unruly kids on the streets, they wouldn't allow it. And my friend was involved in stealing cars, making a nuisance of himself in the neighborhood. And basically he got warned by the men of the area. And he carried on, and he got a knock at the door one night. And this is, obviously I'm not naming names, but this is what happened. The men said to his father, you either beat the living daylights out of him now in front of us, or we do it. And if we do it, it's going to be a lot worse. So his own father had to take him out and show him a lesson in the back garden. And my friend, you know, when I knew him, this was 10 years after, he says it was the best thing that ever happened to him. Because the path he was going down, these people who knocked on the door only gave you one beating up as a warning, and then it would get serious. So again, similar to what you're saying, sometimes people have to use drastic measures.
So what's the traumatic event?
Yeah.
What's a traumatic event? The beating up is a traumatic event, and it has got a long-lasting effect, or in this particular story. So all the hallmarks of the definition of trauma are there, but the effect is a change in behavior that allows the person to understand in a different way its environment, the effect he is having, his behavior is having on that environment, and they come together. He's learned something so that he can adjust his behavior to suit or to fit in with the environment. That at times is necessary. You know, when the environment is extremely only gives narrow space for the child to develop in, then this environment maybe needs to open up a bit, allows more for the child. But if the child is taking up too much space in that environment, as in, you know, that's my property, not yours, why are you taking it? Then that needs to be stopped. And the quickest way in which that particular message of stop your behavior can be brought to a young child, a growing teenager, is in a direct way. which means the environment, my surroundings, are responding to me and showing me what they are not accepting. This message is not the same when it goes through a court case and a institution or several institutions and prison and what have you. It's not the same, because that child, that growing child or the young adult, will defend himself against that. While in your story, you know, if the teenager gets beaten up by 3 big men, he can't defend himself. And the message is, you behave or this is going to happen again. And there's nothing he can do about it. He's no longer in control. And that's an important one. But it's interesting to note that it's about a traumatic event with a long-lasting effect. But it can have a positive change. It can have the effect of a positive change in somebody's life, meaning more in alignment of the environment. And so it's not all bad.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you mentioned the positive effect of trauma. So I'll just mention one positive effect. If a woman's been beaten by a dad, now that there's one way that could be negative, and you could get in relationships that repeat themselves when she's older. But there can women who said, you know what, I will never, ever allow a man to lay a finger on me ever. And so that's a positive effect of trauma, because they've said, no, that isn't good behavior. And I'm going to make the firm decision now not to allow that if I ever get married. So that's one aspect of positive.
Yeah, pointing out that it's not the event that is traumatic. It's the individual's response to the event that makes it, we call it then traumatic if it's got a negative effect. But, you know, in essence, if it's got a long-lasting effect, it falls under the definition of trauma. But you can have both effects, because the effect is caused by the response of that individual to that particular event. It's not the event itself.
Yeah, so my last question tonight, I'm not sure how much time we've got, but I'll leave you with this last one. So this is in the case of what I would say is an event or a trauma beyond what we would perceive as to be natural. So extreme childhood, probably physical or sexual abuse. Now, there's a lady who is actually from Belgium. I think I possibly mentioned the last week, Aniki Lucas. I'll try and find a good interview with her and put it below, who from 6 to 11 years old, she was pushed into by her own mother into be a sex slave for basically the world's political and business elites. Now, what is interesting in her story is she got no affection off her mother whatsoever. So when she was pushed into these parties as a young girl, before the abuse started, at least for her, she was getting attention. But obviously then this horrific abuse starts coming in, and it does get pretty bad. And they're trying to desensitize these children to acts of violence. They'll get them to murder rabbits and things like that. We're talking extreme abuse. But in her mind-controlled program that she was put on to be this sex slave, when she was being raped by these perpetrators, she got to see them in their weak state. You would think that would be their powerful state, but actually, for them to do what they were doing, she was explaining she saw their own broken child. And it seems like it was just, they were abused when they were children, but it was traumatic, and it ongoing, and it literally built them. Like you've seen, you built from these first 3 years. And there are some people, unfortunately, that are actually built that way. But deep, deep, deep within that person, there's still that traumatized, abusive person. There was still a little child wanting to be a child. And that her path to healing, somehow she was being trained to be one of these people. But at 11 years old, she had the awareness somehow to get out, and she managed to get out. That's quite a big story. But yeah, she seen that little spark of humanity that was still there in these heavily abused people, and she almost, her part of her healing was trying to understand that. And her own healing from this horrific abuse was understanding the process and understanding the broken child in her own perpetrators. So I just thought that that's quite interesting. So somebody's been deeply abused like that, it's very difficult, I know, and there are a lot of broken people out there, but I think she's an example of possibly a path that could be, even people go through extreme things, that there is a path that you can take to at least find some stability in later life.
Yeah, you need to have a very strong constitution on that particular part, whatever part you're struggling with, to be able to crawl out of a hole that deep. But just an interesting detail. How does an 11-year-old child get out of a children's sex ring? Well, she was rescued by a Belgian gangster. So, maybe this guy did some good too. Maybe he wasn't just all bad. Who knows? Don't judge because you don't know. And the one thing that is, or the way not to judge, because people find it very difficult not to judge situations, other people, and so on, and other lives. But the way not to judge is to realize all the time, realize that nothing happens just out of the blue. There are reasons for it. There are reasons in the past. Things have been building up to this point. No matter how bad that point may be, or you consider it to be very bad, no matter how extreme that point might be, there are reasons for it. And if you were on that path, you would be on that point now. So don't judge the other person for being there on that particular point and doing all these, in your eyes, so-called bad things, because there are reasons for it. It's not just done for fun or for whatever you may consider it to be. Reasons. Just as you have reasons to do what you're doing, to believe what you're believing. I always say to people, you have your reasons. Other people see those reasons as excuses.
I think that is another message, if you want to get even political about this, is when the so-called West are pushing freedom and democracy around the world, which on one level we know is a joke, but at least on the surface, we don't like how that dictator looks after his people. We think he's a bad ruler. We're going to go in there and sort it out. It's on a level of judgment that is not only wrong, it's completely so wrong that they always make things worse.
The judgment
interfering. It's based on a judge and interfering.
Yeah, the judgment is made by you for your own benefit. You need to have an excuse to infiltrate another land, or to infiltrate your neighbor's life, or whatever it is. You are looking for an excuse. Yeah, that's why you make that judgment. So social services make the judgment that a particular child's life is in danger. That's a judgment. So they need the excuse to make themselves feel better, and to go in and do something which is good for the child because you say so.
So ultimately, when we're talking about, because all information from the environment has to be processed and then we respond, when we're talking about these traumas, whether it be what we would perceive as a small trauma but is big to the child, or what we would perceive as a big trauma like abuse, but we don't know what the response is going to be, is the long-term effect, the inability to process that information, and it's got stuck because the child can't reason on it, and so that it hasn't been processed and it's stuck there.
It's yeah, but it's stuck there certainly in our modern times. It's stuck there because we as a society and medical profession and authorities are helping to keep it stuck. We keep it stuck there. In a normal environment, natural environment, how is it possible that no animal over these billions of years has had any trauma that was there for the rest of his life? And we humans, we have traumas that we take with us for the rest of our lives. Why is that? Because we do not allow our environment to change enough so that we can rewrite those responses that we've got, that we have written down when we were younger. So you have an event, you can't deal with it, it's stuck. The way to get rid of it is to give that same person experience upon experience upon experience of the opposite, and allow this person to express his grief, anger, whatever it is, but show them that life is different. And if life really is different, in other words, it's repeatedly shown to me that life is not what I experienced in the past, then I overcome my trauma. Then I can push my trauma aside. I can think about the event and not repeat the responses. But you gave the example earlier about a traumatized dog. You know, if you feel sorry for the dog, then that dog will not recover. That dog will continue with its same responses. Well, we humans do just that. We continue with the same responses. Why? Because they're encouraged. How? You must talk about it. Let's have a rebirthing. Let's go back there. Do hypnosis. Let's go back there so that you can relive it. Why? I want to get rid of it. I don't want to go back there again. So we need a different environment with different experiences so that we no longer need those frequencies, those antennae to stay out and give us that same bloody response all the time, because by doing that, we keep it activated. It can never go away because the antenna is pushed out all the time. And what's even worse, it's activated, and so you get the same response. So our conscious mind, stimulated by our environment, you have helplines for everything. You need to talk about everything. And if you don't talk about it, then we'll put television programs on it and we'll put it on the internet so you can always look for it. And don't forget, nowadays, with algorithms and targeted advertising, that is what these people are coming across. That is what they're getting on their tablet. Read this, see this. Here is a healing therapy for it. Here is this, here. Advocating healing therapies means you're ill. You need my help. You can't fix this on your own. The only thing they need is loving people, people that give them, that are aware of the experience that they've had, and they give them different experiences, just like you would do with a dog. You would try and give it different experiences. But you, with that dog, will also have to look at that dog, how it's responding, to find out what exactly it is that is so traumatic for that animal. And you want to avoid that. And by avoiding it, you can teach it different responses. And that is what we need to do with the children that are living with traumas and with the adults that are living with traumas. We don't need to give the adults an audition with the Pope. We don't need to do that. We don't need to put perpetrators on trial. We don't need to do that. We need to give them different environment to grow up in, to live their life in. That is what we need to do. That's all I've got to say on it, I think.
Yeah, I can say. Yeah, I can say from my experience in my job, the only dogs I've been bitten by or had interactions with, one bit me, my fault, because I've got quite a lot of knowledge on dogs. Were customers who had rescue Alsatian dogs who'd been traumatized. And even though they were giving them nice big homes in country homes, they felt sorry for them.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the only aggressive dogs that attacked me. Now, I'm lucky I know how to deal with that. And these are Alsatians. But the owners felt sorry for them.
Yeah.
And what them dogs were reaching out for was somebody to lead them and say, no, that's finished now. It's done. This is how we're going to live now. Yeah. That aggression you've got, because whatever happened, it doesn't matter. That aggression you've got through fear is not relevant anymore, because I'm the pack leader. Well, I'm talking how dogs work. I'm the pack leader and we move on. And my experience with dogs, that works 100% of the time. When you feel sorry for a dog, they stay in the fearful state and then they're the ones that bite you. And obviously humans are a lot more complicated beings, but the past is the past. As traumatic as it was, the past is the past. Be conscious of it, and then there has to be a point of not 4, 5, 6 years of counselling that doesn't get anywhere. There has to be a point where, and it has to come from the individual. You take a deep breath and say, I'm done with this. I'm done. I'm just going to live my life now. And like you say, if you've got an environment that supports that instead of holds that and keeps you into the past, I think that's possibly a way forward. I personally can't say another way forward.
No.
And I know it's not easy. I know some people have a lot of stuff to deal with, but I just can't see that there's another way forward.
There isn't one. No.
So I think we'll leave that there tonight. And I think that could possibly interesting for next week, staying on this psychological trauma, if we go into what actually makes something toxic. So we're going to go into the physical world a little bit of physical environment, but see it from a different way. And also allergies, because in your book, Your Health in Your Hand, you're taking allergies out of the physical level. So there's the physical thing that we call an allergen, but there's this energetic environment behind that that I'd like to go into, because I think that'll continue from tonight, if that sounds okay.
That's it. That's perfect. That's fine. Yeah, that's what we'll do.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much.
Okay, till next week then. Bye-bye.